Okay, let's take a look at Chapter 1 of the Education of Augie Merasty. The title of this section is called School Days, School Days. Okay, so we're going to go through some of these questions in your study guide and just make sure that we're looking at the details of the text. So the first question, where is Augie born? What year was he born? You can find that on page 2. He said, I was born in 1930 at Sturgeon Landing and baptized there by Father Aquinas Merton, OMI, who was also the head administrator and principal of St. Therese Residential School from 1927 when the school was opened. So he was born in 1930 in Sturgeon Landing, and Sturgeon Landing is in northern Saskatchewan. How many of Augie's family members attended St. Therese Residential School? He goes on page 2. He says, 2 of my sisters and my brother Peter were the first 3 to walk inside the school. Annie and Jeanette were the names of my 2 sisters. There were also 6 uncles and the same number of aunts who attended the school in its first year. All those sisters and cousins, uncles, and many other unrelated people from other villages told me what had happened. Good and bad, positive or negative, were told to me and others when we got to school 8 years later, and they all told basically the same stories. So one has to assume that they were speaking the truth and nothing but. So he has many family members who attended the school, and he was also attending the school. Sisters, his brother, as well as 6 uncles and 6 aunts. So a lot of his family members have attended the same residential school. Where has Augie submitted his stories? Why has he sent the stories to these lawyers? Page 2 again, he talks a little bit about his stories. He says, a lot of their stories I already wrote and submitted to our lawyers, who number about 36 across Canada, representing the survivors of residential schools. The 6 that are working with me and others here in Saskatchewan have offices downtown in Saskatoon. So he's talking about submitting his stories. He's at this point, he's already submitted those stories to the lawyers, and the lawyers are there representing him in the settlement agreement. So across Canada, in around 2007, there was the settlement agreement by the government of Canada, who were financially compensating those residential school survivors because of what they experienced as children. So the lawyers were representing the residential school survivors, including Augie, in this class action suit against the Canadian government. So his lawyer has taken those stories and submitted them, and this is the testimony that he has submitted to the lawyers during this class action suit. Prior to entering the school, he has this brief description of traveling with his father by canoe in order to get to the school. And on page 1, he describes, he says, around the 26th of August, 1935, my father decided it was time for us kids to be taken to Sturgeon Landing by canoe, which was propelled by a 4-horsepower motor. It took us several days to get there on the river. So he kind of describes the arduous journey that his father led to take the children to the residential school. And it gives us a little bit of hint at the lifestyle that Augie was used to prior to what we'll see the environment of this school system. So it's very much his family, his culture is tied up with the country. the wildlife. He talks about, hunting and fishing with his father, traveling by canoe. It's kind of this rustic lifestyle that he's accustomed to. And his father, even, while they're traveling, he shoots and kills a bull moose, and they stay there and prepare the meat. So hunting and fishing are the kinds of, traditional ways of life that Augie is used to before entering into the very strict, rigid, hierarchical structure of the school system. Okay, next question. Who is Father Aquinas Merton and who is Father Bernard Pommier? How are these men different in their characterization? So on page 2 and 3, he introduces the principal. So at the time when he enters, Augie is like 5 years old. And the former principal, he says, Father Aquinas Merton was the hardest working man that I have ever known. Well, he was not like the next one. It was just the opposite with this kind and friendly principal, Father Bernard Pommier. He never touched a plow or other farm implement, and I could honestly could say I have never saw him enter the barn. He was always super clean and wouldn't go into a smelly barn, let alone drive a team of horses or milk a cow or shovel and scrape dung. No, sir. He always had to be immaculately dressed and preferred to have all the privacy he could get. And then he later says, no one could ever say anything bad about this principal, Father Bernard Pommier. He was a far cry from the principal who took over 2 years after I left the school, Reverend Father L. Lazardo. I will write about him later. So he talks about, the two principals, and Father Aquinas Merton was the hardest working man who used to do the farm labor, in the barns and milk cows and scrape dung. And then there was the other father, Father Bernard Pommier, who he says was a far cry from that hardworking former principal. But again, he starts off showing some of the good characteristics of these authority figures. How old was Augie when he started residential school? Page 4 gives us a little bit more information. So he says, yes, in the fall of 1935, at the tender age of 5 years plus 8 months, my father made arrangements with the principal, Father Aquinas Merton, to allow me to start schooling, even though I was not of school age. I would be 6 in January 1936. Due to the distance from the residential school and the need to travel in winter by dog team in extremely cold weather, it would be very hard on a 6-year-old just to take him to St. Therese School. And that winter, my father and my family had decided to go way up north to trap. So they took me to the school at the end of the summer when I was still 5 years old. So Augie was a little younger than the rest of the children who were there, but due to the circumstances of his parents' traveling up north and the difficulty of traveling in the winter, they allow Augie to start school at an earlier age, so he's not 6 years old yet. He's under 5 and 8 months. What does Augie say about Brère Lapine, and how does this add foreshadowing to the narrative? Page 4 is the first time that he mentions Brère Lapine, and this is what he has to say about this school authority figure. So he says, it was that fall that I first laid eyes on the one human I would dislike for the rest of my school term, if not for the rest of my life. Brère Lapine, pronounced Le Pain, who was there from before I arrived and stayed at St. Therese until 1939 or 1940. But I will not talk about him now. I want to keep talking about the nice ones. So we get a little glimpse of Brère Lapine, and we know that Augie's feelings for him, he says, I would dislike for the rest of my school time, if not for the rest of my life. So it seems as if he is, continuously haunted or disturbed by this man, Brer LePain. Um, and it's kind of hinting at this idea or foreshadowing some of the terrible or bad experiences that Augie had as a child in the residential schools. We don't quite know the truth of what happened or Augie's full story yet, but we just get that little glimpse, so that's why it's foreshadowing. And then you might also think about the name LePain. It does have some maybe symbolic um, meaning behind it as well, or a little bit of, um, you know, satirical edge to it. I don't think that's the person's real name. I think David Carpenter maybe changed some of these names, but LePain seems very appropriate, I guess we'll say, for somebody who is so abusive to the children, as we will find. Okay, question number 7. So he's talking about the nice ones he talked about. He says, I want to keep talking about the nice ones. So this chapter does cover some of the kinder, gentler, less abusive authority figures at St. Therese Residential School. And he talks about some of the good and kind and loving um, teachers, instructors that he had there. But why do you think he includes these nice memories in a narrative about residential schools? Um, you could have, many different reasons why he might include that, but I do think as a memoir, it does capture an authenticity that maybe makes this experience come to life. It gives it a kind of authentic feel, that he's not just giving us one account of abuse after another, which maybe was his testimonies that he submitted to the lawyers, but this is a book, right? This is his full story. A memoir is something trying to capture a moment in time as authentically and truthfully as possible. So to ignore the kind and loving ones that were there would be a kind of injustice too against the reality of what happened. So he wants to be as authentic as possible. And I think it does sort of set us up for the shock of how disturbing the cruel experiences that will come. So he's sort of setting us up. There were nice ones, there were nice people there. Not all of them were evil or bad, but there were both kinds, right, of people in the world and at the school as well. Question 8, what punishment does Sister Alphonse inflict on the disobedient boys? So yeah, he describes Sister Alphonse on page 4 and 5. So she's one of the nice ones. He says, I want to talk about my first class teacher for grade 1. Her name was Sister Saint Alphonse. She was one of the most kindest and most loving persons in that institution. And then he says, once in a while, when some boy was extremely disobedient and wouldn't do what he was told, she would use the small ruler we kept at our desks and tap him on the palm of his hand very lightly. And we could see that both of her eyes were shedding tears, which she wiped with her white kerchief. It didn't happen too often. She never changed in her loving and kindly ways. And I'm sure she is still that way. I met her 10 years ago in Nipawin, Saskatchewan, and she kissed me hard. Bless her. So she was one of the nice instructors, and even she was forced to, or like that was part of how the teachers gave punishments. It was sort of part of the school structure that she would have to hit them with a ruler if they were disobedient, and when she had to do that, she felt, that she struggled inside giving that she, felt bad about doing that. So Augie thinks of her as a kind and loving person. And then question number 9. How does Augie describe the difference in the food given to the school administrators and that given to the children? So he is going to go into some of the details of the food and the difference between the food, and I want you to pay attention to any description of the food, because I do think it's sort of a symbol in the book, and gives us, uh, concrete reality that the children were not fed as well as the fathers and brothers and sisters who ran the school, and it does lead us to think that that they viewed the children as less important and as inferior, and dehumanized the children in the way that they treated them. So he describes on page 6 the bread that the children were given. And he says, it was always the same bone-dry bread that raised heck with our gums and teeth. The fathers, sisters, and brothers enjoyed beautiful white bread served by Sister St. Virginia Rose, who was their special cook. I swear those people of the school administration would not even look at our bread or our food. To them, it was puke. So we get a very straightforward kind of statement by Augie that the school administrators wouldn't eat the bread that they served the children. So it wasn't good enough for them, but it was good enough for these children. It tells us something about how they viewed the children or devalued them. And then they viewed their food as not even food. To them, it was puke. It was, not even worth eating. Basically inedible bone-dry bread. So that gives us a little clue or hint of the devaluation, dehumanizing that was going on in the schools, and how the children were perceived by these church authorities or school authorities. On page 8, Augie gives us a little clue or hint of how many children went to the school in total, and he describes the scene. He says, well, he's talking about one of these sisters that they used to call Old Bodo, Sister Daminity. And he describes her, and he says, one can imagine the sound of 110 children all talking and laughing together. She didn't like to be called Obodo, but she was okay. So 110 children together at this school. And he goes on in this chapter to describe, the behaviors practiced by the good and kind ones, the authority figures at the school. So if you want to just, think about some of the behaviors that are practiced by the good or kind authority figures at the school, you might list, treating the children with kindness and loving ways, not hurting them, not punishing them physically, not using the strap or the ruler to beat them. He talks about Brother Beauville, who never said a mean word against any of the boys, who respected them as people, and just showing basic human kindness and gentleness in their roles. So there were these types of people also at the school. And I think this gives us a more complete picture of the residential schools. So that's part of the memoir, like we were talking about. It is a more authentic picture than maybe the the typical view of residential schools that we do have. So it gives us a little bit more of a round whole picture.